Hello, and welcome to the Mothers of All Crime. This is a podcast where we deep dive into mothers involved in infamous crimes and scandals. I'm Monica, and this is Crystal. So, our mom this week is Jennifer Crumbley. That's who we're going to be talking about. And I've watched a lot of videos on YouTube because her whole trial was on YouTube. And I have tried to read as much as I can about her and what's available. But obviously, there's a lot of mixed opinions, and I think it's an interesting case to talk about. So, if we want to start talking about Jennifer Crumbley as our mom, I think we need to go back a little bit and talk about the actions of her son.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one thing about this case that's so interesting with the things changing is, like you said, her case is
Hmm.
on YouTube. So that's not historically been very something that's normal, that's public, but that's slowly changing. And I think how high profile her son became is part of the reason why she herself became so high profile.
That's interesting.
So her son, we're going to go back to Oxford High School in Michigan on November 30th, 2021. Her son Ethan was 15 years old and
Oh,
went to
yes.
school like any other day for everybody else, and it turned devastating for so many people in most of that town.
Yeah. I mean, so traumatic. He had a 9mm handgun and started a mass shooting at his high school and ultimately killed four other high school students.
Yeah,
And a teacher was.
there were, like you said, four students shot. There were six that had critical injury, and one teacher was also shot in that shooting.
Absolutely terrifying and devastating. Although 2021 was a big year for school
Mm-hmm.
shootings. It was a record high that year. There was hundreds, literally hundreds of school shootings in 2021 in America. But this one is different than all the others. There's one really, really key difference between this case and all the other cases of school shootings. Um, because there have been many, many minors that have been perpetrators of school shootings. But Ethan Crumbley is the first one to have his parents criminally charged in connection to their school shooting. Jennifer and her husband James have been accused of, and Jennifer has ultimately been convicted of involuntary manslaughter, which is groundbreaking, precedent setting.
Right. It's a very interesting avenue that the courts decided to take in the prosecutor. And there was only one other case in history that a parent was charged responsible for the actions of their child. And like you said, this is the first time it was a school shooting related one. And I have such mixed feelings for it, particularly because Ethan himself also was alive and charged, which I think is an interesting kind of like
Yes.
factor to it. It's not like there was he took his own life or there was an incident with him. He is still alive. He went to court. He had his own trial and was convicted as well. So that's a key factor
Yeah.
that it's not just her, it's her, her husband, and her son. So all three ended up in a court.
Yes. And Ethan Crumbley was convicted, got life without parole plus 24 years. So he's not getting
Right.
out. And like you said, he's already being held responsible for this crime that he committed. And there is no question that he committed it. It was witnessed, it was confessed to, he pled guilty. There is no question at all about who committed the
Right.
shooting.
And his charges and conviction went through in October of 22, so relatively recent compared to some of the other stuff we've talked
Mhm.
about. But he ended up having 24 counts charged against him, including terrorism, which I think was an interesting kind of addition on
Yeah.
there. A lot of the other ones made sense, like murder and things like that. But the terrorism one was an interesting
Hmm.
addition um, that the prosecutors added on there.
Is that not typical for school
It
shooters to get
it's an
charged with
interesting one
terror?
because I think the public opinion. So, one thing about this case is public opinion drove a lot of the actions from the prosecutor. And I think public opinion had a lot to do with the 24 total counts. I am not an expert with school shootings, but terrorism by definition typically isn't one that I have seen. It might be more popular than I'm
Mm,
aware of, but normally you're taking more of the avenue of the guns and the murder, like assaults, the injuries, things like that. But the terrorism one was interesting because it was not necessarily motivated in any specific way that relates to terrorism, but he was charged for it. So clearly there was enough for them to be confident in that.
yeah. I mean, I guess he did incite
Right.
terror, but and regardless, you can only be imprisoned once at a time. Like, so all of the charges that he got, I, he could be charged with anything. It doesn't matter because he's never getting out of prison anyway. So he's
Yeah.
done. And a lot of school shootings, especially like you said, it ends in the gunman's killing themselves. But Ethan turned himself over to police, and there was no suicide by a cop. There was no attempt at suicide. It seems pretty clear from his writings and the communications that he had that he knew he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison after this shooting.
Yeah. Which kind of gives that
It was not a surprise to
thought
him.
into like he was aware. There's no question he was aware of his actions. It wasn't like he had a traumatic break all of a sudden and like he knew what he was doing. Like looking back at everything. Hmm.
Yeah, he definitely knew what he was doing. It was premeditated. He acted alone. But the question really, when it comes to Jennifer Crumbley, is what responsibility did his parents have in this violent, horrible attack that he carried
Yeah.
out? And I think you could make an argument either way. And the more I have consumed, the more I feel that it is appropriate for Jennifer and James to be charged. I do think that they are responsible, but I could understand the argument against it, and that's why I'm like looking forward to discussing it with you because it is
Yeah.
nuanced.
And I think one particular thing that was so strong with this case is there were so many indicators that the parents were aware of prior to Ethan to doing his school shooting. So there were moments where the
Right.
school addressed concerning behavior with them. There were moments where he actually did a drawing of like a
Hmm.
shooting and kind of predicting what he was going to do. He made it pretty clear. And this is all looking back at it, going, yeah, how did you not see that? But um, particularly with the school, addressing these concerns, asking the parents to come pick him up from school, and they said no because they had to work.
That is a very interesting portion of this that I definitely want to talk about. So on the day of this shooting, which was November 30th, 2021, a drawing was noticed that Ethan Crumbley did, and it was a picture that he had drawn of a gun. There was, it said, it said blood everywhere, help me, my life is useless. And there was pictures of blood and shootings and guns, and he was drawing it in class. The teacher brought it to the attention of the guidance counselor, who called his parents. They did both come to the school pretty much right away, but the guidance counselor testified during the trial, and he said that the parents were not acting concerned, that they didn't show any affection or concern for Ethan, and it was suggested that they bring him home or bring him to a therapist that very day because the counselor thought that he was at a risk to harm himself, and the parents said that they had to work. And it was shown in court that his mother had a lot of flexibility and could work from home with her job,
Mm,
and that she was still planning on attending a horse riding lesson later that day. Um, and the father, James Crumbley, he's door dashing.
right.
That's his back to work. So there's nobody expecting you yet.
Yeah,
So
there was no excuse. And that's, I think, where you start seeing reasons on them being charged is just the neglect and non-importance that they put towards the circumstance, where you have professionals saying that they're concerned about something and you're just like, no, doesn't matter, don't believe you, when they were totally capable of doing so.
right. To be fair, they were not told that they had to bring him home. It was
Right.
suggested, but it was not, you must take him out of here.
And that's going to come back later for the school and problems with them too.
There's issues on all sides, but I think that there's a very important piece of information that it would have been good for Mr. and Mrs. Crumbly to explain to the school while they were discussing this drawing, and that is another very important factor in this case, and that is that James Crumbly had recently purchased a 9mm handgun for his son. His possessions were not searched at school during this drawing incident, but maybe he would have been searched if the school was aware that he had been given a gun for Christmas.
And that's where I think it's interesting is coming from that area, getting your son a gun for Christmas is not super abnormal, but it's more of the fact that
Hmm.
when he bought the gun, because obviously you can't buy a gun for a minor, so he would have bought it in his name, gave it to his son, but it was never properly stored in the home.
Yes.
And Ethan had open access to it. And I think that's more of the key because in the state, 40% of people in Michigan own a gun. There's hunting and they're extremely familiar with it and just personal safety and things like that. But if you're not taking those precautions when you have it in the home, that's when things start to get sticky.
Well, I will say when I originally started looking at this case, I thought that only the dad should have been charged because the dad purchased the gun, gave him access to the gun, and I thought maybe Jennifer would get off because she was less accountable. But the day prior to the shooting, Jennifer Crumbley took Ethan to the shooting range. They both shot his new 9mm handgun. And when they returned to the house, instead of taking the gun and putting it in a locked area that was hidden from their son, she left it in the trunk of the car. And she later went on to claim that her husband secured it and locked it up, and that's where it was. But the last adult known to definitely have control of the gun was her, and that she left it in her trunk.
Yeah. And
So
again,
she gave him
I'll
access the day
circling
before.
back to the access. Um, because I feel if
Yeah.
you're a lot of gun stores, the NRA, things like that, when you have children in the home, it's highly encouraged to teach your child to understand what it is, how it works, things like that, because that's when, if they don't understand, they think it's a toy and they can hurt themselves or someone else. So, them teaching him how to use it, I don't necessarily see the problem, but it's the fact that he had open access to it. Because again, culturally, that area, it's not abnormal for people to have guns in the home. So,
And they were a family that went to the shooting range. That is
right.
a thing that they did together.
So, minus the fact of what Ethan did, him knowing how to responsibly handle that is not necessarily a bad thing. It's the fact that his parents gave him free access to it with no concern of what he could do, is I think where the issue mainly is. People are going to have different opinions on if minors should be using guns in general, but I feel like that's a completely different
For
conversation.
sure.
um,
Sure, sure. I mean, I think that there's a big reason that minors are not allowed to purchase guns. and that is because their brains aren't fully developed and they're not considered to be responsible enough to control themselves all of the time. And it's a scary amount of power and danger and responsibility that come with owning a
Hmm.
gun. So if he is being given access to it for hunting or target shooting or whatever activity that's being supervised by his parents, I don't actually have a problem with that. But you're right, he continued to have access to the gun at home. It doesn't seem like it was a big concern or a big priority to keep this out of his reach. Jennifer bought 100 bullets the day before the shooting at and they used 50 of them. So there are still 50 bullets and he knows where the handgun is and presumably had access to it.
And when you have a school shooter, there are some characteristics that are pretty common, like for a lot of them, and there's a lot of warning signs. So if your child is isolated, rejected by his peers, bullied often, if there's any, he becomes socially withdrawn, mental health concerns, those are some kind of starts. But then you also don't want to take just your child's getting bullied, he's going to become a danger, because then it goes into more of he starts depicting violence in expressional ways, like the drawing he did that the school pointed out. He could have started doing violence toward animals, increased anger, trouble in the home, which I think connects to Jennifer was having an affair. And you got to wonder if Ethan was aware of it. And
Yeah, I mean, she was having an affair and that was a huge part of the trial. And I personally don't think it's that relevant. Maybe he knew about it, but I don't think that's why he did this.
no,
I think they just really wanted to make her look terrible in court because another thing they brought up constantly, constantly during the trial is that all she cared about were her
mm-hmm.
horses.
Well, again,
Jennifer owned two horses and spent about $20,000 the year previously on
yeah.
their care.
And don't get me wrong, horses are not cheap, but I think the reason they did
No, they're
that
not.
is to reinforce the characteristics of how to create a school shooter. And if you have neglect, trouble in the house, not getting along, those are going to support Ethan's behavior, which then brings Jennifer responsible.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
And 81% of school shooters tell someone before they do it that they're going to do it. And you have to wonder if like that got back to him or he did tell somebody. It was pretty general knowledge he had access to this gun. So like if he told someone, like a friend or like classmate or whoever, and nobody said anything, like there's that other question that I'll never get an answer to.
He did make weird statements to his friend, and there was another risk factor that came up pretty recently. I think it was Halloween. His only friend, his best friend, the only person he hung out with outside of school, had moved away.
Mm-hmm.
And it was out of the blue, and all of a sudden he doesn't have his friend that he goes bowling with, his only friend that he really hangs out with, one that he had told his friend multiple times that his parents were ignoring him and laughing at him when he was saying that he had depression and that he was seeing demons in the house and that he wanted to see a doctor. He told his friend all of those things, and there are text messages that were shown during the trial, and the parents say that they did not laugh it off and that those things were exaggerated. But I do think that he made disclosures to his friend and to his parents about disturbing thought
Right.
patterns, at
Yeah.
least.
So as kind of this all after his incident, obviously, people took to social media with everything else that they do. It's pretty normal these days. And public opinion not only went after Ethan, they went after the parents. And I think that kind of started the idea of prosecutors going after them. Because the one thing with the law and law enforcement is unfortunately public opinion drives a lot of cases nowadays.
That's true. And the tide turned on them pretty
Yeah.
quickly. Parents are always blamed, though, for school shootings.
Right.
Like, that is the first line of people that are blamed. It's either that, or it's bullying, or it's some sort of incel situation. But I would say parents are the first people that are blamed. And that makes sense because these are minors that are committing horrific actions. So you think, well, that couldn't happen in a normal family, in a normal
Right.
home where love was
You're
shown.
clearly
But
neglectful.
I think that, right. But I think that most of the time that has not been the case. I mean, I do think that a lot of school shooters, and I recently was just reading a book called Why Kids Kill, and it's about school shooters in America. And I also was looking at the book that was written by Sue Klebold, who is the mother of one of the Columbine shooters. She wrote a memoir that was really interesting. And I don't believe that Sue Klebold neglected her son. I don't think that she had any reasonable reason to suspect that her son was going to participate in a
Hmm.
massacre. But I think that in the year 2021, we know a lot more about warning signs, and that these parents had more of an obligation to be aware that he had so many risk factors to do
Right.
this. And I think that's why they're ultimately being charged when none of these other parents, none of these other hundreds of school shooters, none of their parents were charged.
Yeah, it
Although,
oh
oh, I'm
no.
sorry, I was just going to say, there were people that were criminally charged after Columbine.
Right.
And in that situation, the shooters were both dead, but the people who bought their guns were charged with helping them. And I wrote it down how much time they got served. So two of their friends had helped them acquire weapons after the Columbine shooting. One of them got 6 years in prison, and one of them got 4.5 years in prison. And these were people that knew, presumably, that they were going to commit a school shooting. And the parents in this case are facing up to 60 years.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say is there's never been a case that the shooter is living when it's happened, at least that I could find, because there have been plenty of examples where
Mm,
there have been people charged in association, aware, accessory, things like that, kind of like you mentioned with Columbine, but like having the gunman himself alive and being held responsible and continuing those charges is very interesting. And it could open either a slippery slope to a lot of unnecessary charges, be able to help protect a lot of different people in the future. So it could go really either way. Yes.
definitely a good point. And I think that they're trying to set a precedent. And I don't necessarily disagree with that goal. I do have some mixed feelings about the parents being charged at all and about the amount of time that they're potentially facing. Um, but I do think that they had a level of responsibility. And if this will make people think twice about allowing their children to have access to weapons, then I think
Yeah, so the
it's
court case
a
itself,
good cause,
she
and
was
I'm
charged
ultimately
with
supporting it.
involuntary manslaughter, like you said, and was convicted. When the charges actually went out, which I thought
Mm,
was funny
hmm.
that I didn't know until we started looking into this case, is the two parents failed to show up for their arraignment and were hunted by the U.S. Marshal's office. They only lasted 24 hours before
They
they
went
were
on the
found, but
run.
still, the fact that you thought you didn't have to show up just kind of reinforces that they just didn't take the whole thing seriously, even after this terrible day. They still were like, meh, it's fine. Like, that's crazy to me.
They 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 were sleeping in a storage unit of like their artist friend's loft. It was not a building that you're allowed to sleep in. They were legitimately on the run. And there's a video, a police body cam video of them being found and being basically shaken awake by cops that are arresting them. They said that they
Sure,
took
you
four
are.
Xanax and that they were sleeping because they were going to turn themselves in the morning. But I mean, I doubt it
Yeah,
because they've been on the run
of course you're
since
gonna turn
prior
yourself
to
in
charges
after
even
you've
being
already
announced
found.
against them. They
Like,
were
of
on the run.
course. Uh, I just
Sure,
think
I
that's
mean,
so
it does sound
comical.
better than we were never going to turn ourselves in. But someone, yeah, someone literally saw on Facebook a description of their car and the plate number and called 911 and reported that he saw them in the parking lot where he keeps his cars. And so they were found and charged, and they were held on $1 million for the both of them bond,
Right.
which they didn't have, so they've been sitting in
And
jail awaiting the trial.
interestingly enough, now that his wife has been convicted, her husband, James, has made it very clear that he wants a new venue. And I think that in his interest is the best thing he can do for his own case is to request a new venue. His justification is that he's not going to be able to receive a fair trial, which is his constitutional right,
Yeah.
since his wife has already been convicted there. Um, I think from the outside perspective, you're not going to have any better luck anywhere else. However, you're more likely to have someone on a jury there in that district that has been personally affected by this tragedy. So I do see the tactic, um, but overall, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference for him.
I honestly thought it was kind of strange that they split the trial
I
and
think
split the
it
charges
was a
and that they're
defense
not being tried
tactic,
together.
personally.
Because definitely, definitely. But
Yeah, and I also think from a
his case is so
prosecutor's
bad now that
perspective,
she's been
the
convicted.
angles that they're going to take for both of them is very different. Um, Her angle very much was you are a bad mother, you had an affair, you cared about your horses more than your kid, you smoked weed, like you didn't take care of your son like a mother should. And I think dad's angle is going to be
Yeah.
very much
You're
more of like you're supposed to teach your kid how to be responsible. You shouldn't have had access. They're going to go more focused on the gun, while mom was more focused on what you should have done as a parent. Again, that assumption all women are moms.
That's true. I think that there's an expectation, yeah, that all mothers
Mm-hmm.
just have these innate abilities to predict and prevent any kind of bad behavior on the part of their
Mm-hmm.
child. And I
Oh,
do think that
100%.
we are more quick as a society to blame the mother in this situation. That she must have been withholding and neglectful, and there's no way they
Because
had a
look what
nice mother
happened.
son relationship like she claims. Because, I mean, if you had a nice,
I
right,
agree.
if you had that relationship with him, none of this would have happened. But I just don't think that that's true necessarily. I think they probably did have an okay relationship. It seems like they did a lot of things together as a family. And I mean, I do think that Ethan was a bit of a latchkey kid and that his parents were not home a lot
Mm-hmm.
and he spent a lot of time home alone. But he was 15.
Right. And that's the
At
thing
what
of,
point
I think is
can
really
you spend
hard
some
to
time alone?
reflect is look at the quote unquote average teenager. They're relatively isolated from their parents. They definitely don't tell their parents everything. They're moody. Most of them have experienced some kind of bullying. Like a lot of these kids have all these things and nobody questions it. But then because he did such a traumatic thing, everyone's like, well, he was alone. Their parents did this without him. We're like, right. You also left your kid home alone when you went to dinner at 15 years old. Like, it's that double standard of it.
Yeah. I mean, at 15 years old, you should be a it should not be a huge deal for your parents to have a social life and an activities. I mean,
Sure.
maybe it might have been distressing for him if he knew that his mom was having an
Right.
affair, but that's still not this doesn't justify it. And
Oh, not at
I
all.
don't think that Ethan would even say that he doesn't blame his parents for this at all. He says that this was 100% his idea, that he'd been plotting to
Hmm.
do it, that he's a bad person, and that it's not his parents' fault. But I think as a society, we hold people responsible for the actions
Yeah.
of their kids, even when
And
they are their own people and they're making their own decisions.
absolutely. And I think that was, you took the
I
words
think
right
that
out of
they
my mouth,
were
is like,
willingly naive.
they
They
just
just didn't
didn't
want to see
want to
it.
accept that their child was capable of something like that. And it's that idea of deny, 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 and hope that nothing happens.
And I could
And
understand how that could happen.
oh, 100%. Because no one wants to think the worst of someone, either their child or their friend, family. Nobody wants to think that someone's like that is capable of that and so confidently capable of that. And I think with him specifically, even if we took the fact of the gun was so easily accessed to him in his home, I strongly believe he would have found a way regardless. He had such a plan and such a personal motivation of it. He was going to do this one way or another. The question is, am I going to use the gun I have easy access to, or am I going to get it somewhere else?
I do think, though, that is partially why they're being charged, because parents are supposed to put barriers in place to their kids harming
Mm-hmm.
themselves or others. It's kind of like taking precautions with a baby. Put baby proofing an area so that it doesn't hurt itself. That's your responsibility as the adult. And in this case, it needed to be
They made
childproof.
it too easy.
Yeah,
Yeah, they made it too easy.
they made it
Mm-hmm.
way too easy. But in 3 years, he could have legally purchased these weapons himself, and maybe this would have just happened in 3 years. But I don't think the parents would have been charged in that circumstance.
Oh yeah, but I also like, there are millions of illegal guns in this country where
Mm-hmm.
if you
That's true.
want to find one, you can. And I think for him specifically, he was going to do this one way or another. It was just how. And it was that execution of planning it for him. And his parents made it very easy for him, where it was just there. I'll just use this one. Great. Less to do, which
I
is
just
sad.
I just wonder if the drawings and the videos that he was watching in class, he was watching videos about bullets, about violent shootings in class, if those were cries for help, and at that point someone could have intervened. I think that's also a
Mm.
big portion of why they were charged, because it's not like this came completely out of the blue, but the
Hmm.
timeline is really tight. The parents were literally told that day that he's drawing these weird things in class that are very scary. The school does not force them to take him home. They both return to work, and Jennifer Crumbley is at work when she finds out that there is an active shooter at Oxford High School, and she starts screaming, and she texts Ethan saying, "Don't do it." I mean, she clearly knew that that was a possibility, that he was going to do that.
Right.
Like, I feel like most people wouldn't think, I don't think that's their first thought. Like, I think most
Right. Your first
people,
reaction should be, is, are you okay? Not,
right,
don't do it.
don't do it. And Jennifer Crumbley had sent a picture of what Ethan had drawn in class, to her horse instructor, the person that owned the barn. She sent that picture to her earlier that day. She also sent the picture to her boss. And when the person who owned her barn heard that there was a shooter, she was like, "I know who the shooter is," after seeing that picture.
Hmm.
And again, it's easy in hindsight to say that these are warning behaviors where you should have known, and it was reasonable that you should have predicted and prevented this happening. And I think if the Crumbleys had told the school that he had access to a gun, this could have all been prevented.
Right. But here's the other thing, is they don't have to. If every person who has a gun in their home has to report that to the
Mm,
school, you're looking at two-thirds of the population in our
sure,
country having to say that.
but not all of those kids that have access to guns at their house Not all of them are drawing pictures of guns and blood and writing disturbing things and getting caught doing disturbing things in school. That
Oh,
would have been a good
absolutely.
point to tell them, we just actually bought him a gun earlier this
Yeah.
week.
And I think that's where the father, they're going to bring him into it because it's something that he probably didn't even, if he grew up around them and it's normal in their household, he might not even have triggered to it when he absolutely should have when you're being presented this information.
Hmm. And his father also went home after hearing that there was a shooter at Oxford High School to look for the gun at their house. And he called 911 saying that the gun is not here and my son is at the school.
Yeah,
And
and it's behaviors like that. Like clearly your his parents were aware that this was a possibility. They just
right.
didn't want to accept it. And I think
That's
again that's part of why that charge came through.
right. I think that's where they dropped the ball. I think that's where they ran before charges were even pressed against them because they knew that they could have prevented this that day at least. I don't know about prior to that day, but definitely that day they had an opportunity
To do
and
something and
right,
didn't.
and they didn't.
Hmm.
But did the school also have a responsibility to say, get this kid out of here because his behaviors are disturbing and alarming?
Yeah, and so what are your thoughts on that? Because there, after the fact, there were two cases filed against Oxford Community Schools in December for negligence on the school's behalf. And because Ethan had shown so many warning signs and they didn't mandate anything to happen. It was all, hey, we suggest you do this, or very compliant. And they
Hmm.
were $100 million for each lawsuit against the school district, the superintendent, and the principal.
I do think that there was a moment that day that the school could have intervened as well. I just don't know if it was as reasonable. I don't know. But like you're saying, a lot of people in this community have guns. A lot of people in this country
Mhm.
have guns. A lot of people are able to access weapons, and school shootings are a huge epidemic happening right now. So maybe on the school's part, maybe that would have been a good time to run a risk assessment of Ethan to have him perhaps go to the hospital if he is showing signs that because it was stated by I think the guidance counselor that they were worried about his safety, about him harming himself, and that's why Ethan wasn't sent home by himself because his parents weren't going to be there. So
Mhm.
maybe that would have been a good point to call in a social worker to the school, to call in an ambulance, to take him to the ER to be have a psych evaluation. I don't know though which of those things is the appropriate reaction for a school to have in this situation. I guess,
Yeah.
hmm,
Well, my thought was I know when all of this kind of was happening, or even back in 2012, or I think it was when the Sandy Hook shooting happening, there was a conversation of arming teachers in schools, which
hmm,
I personally don't think should be a thing. It changes the dynamic of a student-teacher relationship. But what about in specifically looking with school shootings, putting a licensed social worker in the schools who has the capability to section someone or put someone on a hold if needed when you have a student showing all of these behaviors, you're genuinely concerned for his safety, other safety, and the parents aren't taking that responsibility. Having someone in the building who's able to go, okay, well, if you're not going to, we're going to put him on a hold and we will take him to go see someone. Also, could cross a line, but it's an interesting avenue when you have parents who are kind of denying the situation.
I do think that would be better. And the truth is that those kind of policies vary by state. And
Right.
there are some states where and that's what I'm talking about risk assessment. Because I was looking and New York, for example, if this situation was happening, that would have been the policy to bring in a social worker to evaluate the situation, someone who's like an LCSW, I guess, and they would be able to help them. connect to resources that they may need. They could also decide that this person needs to go to the hospital. They also have more authority with the parents than the school probably does. But in Michigan, there is no such policy. It was at the discretion of the guidance counselor essentially, which is just a
Yeah.
different it's a different level of accountability and responsibility. But
Yeah.
it's
And I
also
think it,
is yeah, I don't know.
yeah, because if you do that, then it could also help with like the school to prison pipeline that's so prevalent in the United States, could also kind of prevent mental health concerns that lead people into those futures.
I think it's a reality that there are a lot of teenagers that are struggling with mental health issues and that in this country that's manifesting in violence in a lot of situations, and it's not always a mental health issue that leads to a mass shooting, but I think that
Hmm.
it's pretty, like we were saying, there are warning signs that are being displayed, and it would be good to always have someone doing additional screenings to prevent this from happening because it is so traumatic. And I think that they probably will win those lawsuits because this is horrifyingly traumatic. And I think that there's some liability on the school and some liability on the parents. And ultimately, the balls were just dropped here. And
Yeah.
Ethan was displaying a lot of different warning signs, and he was not brought to a hospital. He was not brought to a therapist. He did not see a doctor. It was allowed to just kind of continue.
Right. And I think there actually, in my opinion, was one positive that did come out from this overall like this whole tragedy. It's not good at all. But the one thing that did come out of it is Michigan as a state changed some laws.
Oh, I saw that.
So in Massachusetts, which is, I know a lot of the gun laws up there, there are storage laws where your firearm has to be in a certain type of box. It has to be transported a certain way. You can only have so much ammo within proximity. There's a whole list of things you have to know before you're allowed to purchase
Hmm.
and then maintain. Michigan didn't have any of those laws. So when this incident happened, there were no safe storage laws in place. So technically, the father didn't break any laws. They were in their
Wow.
perfect right to leave it in the trunk, to leave it out. There was nothing mandating them to do anything. And because I couldn't figure out why they kept focusing on that. And then I learned that there were no laws to begin with. And as of February of 2024, the state itself actually passed and started implementing a safe storage law where you're mandated to own a safe in your home if you have guns in your household, which I think, particularly when you have minor children in your home, is definitely something that should be in there.
A hundred
I think
percent.
that is one good thing that came out of this. Not that this was a good circumstance, but it brought light to something that could help future issues because since 2011, school shootings have tripled in our country. Yet the purchase gun rate has stayed exactly the same since 2007. And this was all on Hive if anyone else wants to look it up. But it's interesting, like, there's something in our society is changing. And if you don't have any requirements on where to store things, that at least that's some kind of safeguard to help the issue, maybe.
I definitely think it's a great idea. It's a good change. It's a positive outcome. It's obviously sad how that had to be arrived at, and it seems kind of common sense, and that probably should have been always a
Mm-hmm.
rule. I don't know why there's been such an intense increase in mass shootings, and I know 2021 was particularly bad. I do
Mm-hmm.
think the part of the big reason that the parents were charged in this case was to set a precedent to try to prevent
Yeah.
this from happening in the future. And I think it's a good goal. I don't know if it's going to achieve that goal. But ultimately, I think
No,
that
I don't.
more parents are going to be charged.
Yeah, and I was reading an article, I can't remember what newspaper it was with, but they are a little concerned about the precedents that could be set
Hmm.
because criminal law is so directly connected to the power of the administration, but also the pressures of the community in our country, where there have been plenty of cases that have been gone to court that shouldn't have because the community pretty much demanded it. This is not that case, but what they were kind of expressing is any concern of marginalized communities who do typically have younger children involved in criminal justice already,
Hmm.
having lower income parents now facing criminal charges for their children's behavior, how that could then affect the overall family. So if you have a household with 6 kids, one kid decides to join a gang and does some gang activity, your parents now charged. Now you have 4 kids or 5 kids in the foster system. Like they were just kind of concerned of what door does that open? Is it going to stay with mass shooters and tragedies, or is it going to open to any behavior that your child does?
I wonder if there would have been any more leeway or maybe a plea offered if the Crumbleys had more kids. Because their only child is Ethan, and Ethan's in prison. So
Right.
I think maybe if they had 5 other kids, maybe there would have been at least there would have been a I don't know if the public view would have changed, but I think it would have been a different level of empathy for them, and that maybe there would have been some accommodations and maybe a plea offered. Um, I don't I don't love the idea of every violent minor's parents being charged. I think it's very specific circumstances that
Yeah.
should lead to this kind of situation. I even during all the research that I did about this case, I felt very conflicted about whether Jennifer should be convicted or not. And I had to really put aside a lot of my judgments about what I think her parenting skills were like because that's not really the issue. The issue to me
Mm-hmm.
is what she did that day and how she failed that day. And I think that she was ultimately, she did not stand in the way. And it was a short enough time frame and it was predictable enough. But I think that most gang based, it's just not the same kind of circumstance. I don't see how that, I mean, I could see how it could spin to that, but I definitely don't want that as an outcome. I don't think that that's always appropriate.
No, and I agree. I'm hoping that's not the avenue it goes. That was just that particular article's concern, which I
Hmm.
definitely could see as a possibility, and that's what's scary. Um, because I'm curious if the laws are going to start to change. Because I think a quote from the case that I have is she failed to do her legal duty to exercise reasonable care to control their minor child to prevent the minor child to intentionally harming others. But like it
Yeah.
doesn't define what her legal duty and what reasonable care is. And that's where that kind of gray area comes in with pretty much any law in our country. There's gray. So,
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
um,
it is a nuanced issue, and I don't think
mhm.
that I don't think that this can be applied to all shootings. I do wonder if shootings from the past or ones that have occurred since 2021, if more parents are going to be charged in connection with those, just because of this new precedent that's been set.
Yeah, it will be interesting because I think the other parent, and I don't have it in front of me, but the other parent was a mother of like a 4-year-old who shot someone at a playground by accident with a gun they found or something.
Hmm,
Um,
terrible.
so it'll be interesting how things kind of change overall with parents, but also with parents of children who do like tragic incidences.
Yes, I think
But
a good start
it's
though is
sad.
increasing rules about storage, safe storage of guns. It's very important. I mean, kids need to be if you're going to have them in your house, which I have conflicted feelings about, they do need to be taught to respect them, but also to know that they absolutely do not have access to them without supervision.
Yeah, because if they're just out and about, like, and you think of like little kids, not
Ugh.
necessarily like Ethan who's 15, but if you have a little kid, they touch everything. Like
Yeah,
they're curious, and that's the fear for that one. And then as you get older, you have kids like Ethan who clearly are disturbed to a degree. You just don't know, and like moody. God, teenagers make terrible decisions already, let alone Ethan. So having that implemented, I think, is a good tactic if you're going to keep them in a home with a child who is expressing concerning behavior for sure.
definitely.
Well, her husband will be interesting.
I
His
know. I
case
am
I
gonna
don't
watch.
think has started,
I think it's in
but it's
March,
upcoming.
March 2024.
So it'll
Oh,
be very curious to see if he gets a new venue. I don't think he will, but I'll be very curious if they grant him that.
it's hard though because with social media, it's your physical location is not your only it's not the only people that know about it. You know,
Right.
this did gain national and international attention, but I agree that it will be harder for him to get a jury that doesn't know about it if he stays in that same area, because I think this was
Hmm.
quite a big deal in Michigan.
Yeah, or even just have some kind of that connection of like, I know someone who went to that school that it could have been my kid, or
Mm,
I know the teacher. Like, there's, it's a community, so like having some kind of connection to that school definitely probably exists for the majority. So I see his want, but like you said, when you have social media and everyone has such public access to information from around the country, I don't think it's gonna make a difference. He's gonna get the same outcome.
yeah, that's true. I think he's going to get convicted, but it will be interesting because, like you said, the storage rules around the guns weren't in place yet. So I just would like to see how his case differs from Jennifer, because I do think Jennifer's trial maybe focused a little too much on her affair and just kind of shaming her and making her seem like a terrible person, so she must be a terrible mother.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a lot less of that with James, even though I wouldn't be surprised if he's also having affairs.
Oh, yeah. Wouldn't shock me.
We'll see.
But I agree. I think it'll be interesting where hers was you're a bad mother, and his I think is going to go more of the you did things wrong, which is an interesting tactic.
Yeah. And I was going to say it's not illegal to be a bad mother, but there are points where it is. And
Yeah.
I guess that's what we're running against here is, did she cross the line? And the
Hmm.
jury has spoken that she did. So I guess we'll see what
Yeah.
James has to say for himself if he testifies on his own behalf like Jennifer did.
That also surprised me because
Me
it's
too.
not normally something that defense attorneys want is to put the client up on the stand because it opens the door to being questioned.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting. It didn't work in their favor, but it's an interesting choice they took.
Well, I didn't really want to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Her defense attorney was not good. She was a mess, I felt like. She seemed very disorganized. She seemed like she never knew what she was talking about. She was all over the place. Everything she did was off-putting. I did not really love her defense attorney. I thought the prosecutors were pretty good.
Hmm.
And yeah, I don't know if James has the same lawyer. Oh, it might be a whole different case with a different attorney.
Yeah. Which brings back up that concern, though, of how our justice system works is if you're guilty or not, or you should be charged or not, if you don't have a good attorney, you're probably going to lose.
Right. I mean, it's hard to tell if the attorney was bad or they just had an awful case at some points.
True. That's a
I'm
good
honestly
point.
not sure.
Probably a combination.
Probably a combination. All right. Well, Very interesting. I think that more of these cases, unfortunately, will continue to happen and will evolve with them. But I enjoyed this to whatever extent you can.
Yes. Any final thoughts?
I don't think so.
All
You know
right.
what? I do have a final thought. Don't post things on Facebook because it will come back to haunt you. They literally spent
Oh,
hours of this trial going through Jennifer's Facebook posts.
words to live by.
And yeah, I just don't think that ever helps anyone. In when it goes to court, it doesn't help to have documentation.
Mm-hmm.
So don't provide documentation for the court.
Well, very good. Well, it was great to talk about this case with you,
You
and I
too,
look
you
forward
too.
to our next mother.
Me too. Very soon, coming at you. All right,
All
have a good
right. Have a
one.
good one.